So for those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Mike Stock. And today I'm talking about a paper that I wrote, which is about healing from mental illness and trauma through our work in Lessac, Lessac. You see, 5 years ago I was assaulted. It was a random act of violence, and it took me about 1.5 years to 2 years to become stable again. I had to recover both physically and psychologically, and it would take my entire allotted time to tell you about what a mess I was. So, if you're interested, we can discuss that over drinks. But some of my symptoms after my assault were that physically I used a cane for balance, and as a side effect of medication I gained over 50 pounds. Cognitively, there were times where I couldn't remember where I was or how I got there, and on a few occasions I couldn't even remember my name. Now, at the beginning of my recovery, I didn't have the physical dexterity nor the cognitive memory to do simple tasks like tie my shoes. But as I've joked before, not to worry, I bought a lot of slip-on shoes. Now, a recent study of professional football players helped explain why I was experiencing those issues with thinking, memory, and concentration. Because fMRI scans of the players showed damage to the brain's white matter. White matter is what allows brain cells to send messages to each other. This damage causes the brain to rewire in order to compensate for lost functioning. Similarly, I experienced the entire gamut of psychological effects. This is the most basic way that kinesthetics helped me. Psychologically, it helps return me to the present moment. Because it's my belief that different mental illnesses share some common things, but mainly that you cannot remain rooted in the present moment. I made up this little shorthand, which I'll share with you. That those who are experiencing trauma are stuck in the traumatic event of the past. That those with anxiety are fixated on the future. That those in a manic state disassociate from present reality into euphoria or terror. And those living with depression exist in a limbo state, where they cannot see the joy of the present and cannot find hope for the future. I made up that shorthand because after my assault, I actually experienced all those things. Now, neuroscientists only recently discovered in military veterans with PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, for those that don't know that acronym. And neuroscientists recently discovered with veterans with PTSD that there is scarring on the brain, uniformly across different cases. And that scarring on the brain is between gray matter and white matter. This scarring causes psychiatric issues, which includes mood, anxiety, and sleep disorders, as well as psychotic episodes. Now, traumatic brain injury is currently the leading cause of death and disability among young adults. I don't even qualify as a young adult. But it was medication, it was physical therapy and psychotherapy that helped me recover. But afterwards, the trauma stayed with me. Particularly trapped, I must have kicked out the microphone. Hello? Oh no, that's good. I just kicked the microphone. I was speaking in my voice and body. But after I recovered through therapy and medication, physical therapy and psychotherapy, the trauma was still stuck in my body and in my voice. Because trauma is not the story of something awful that happened in the past. It's the residue that is literally left behind in our physical and vocal systems. It's trapped in our sensory and our hormonal systems, and our brains literally get rewired. Simply, the body internalizes the trauma and attempts to protect against future trauma. But this trauma that's trapped in the body creates a loop of events, and the trauma repeats, both physically, psychologically, and you place yourself into a situation where you're available to that trauma again, because your body and brain and voice have become rewired. Now, after I stabilized, I got into graduate school for acting, and I started working with Lessac kinesthetics. So I'm in class, and I start having these horrendous reactions. All sorts of emotional and psychological stuff, which were triggered by the voice and body work. Oh, what's happening to me? And so I start to get curious. and I start to figure it out. And I think to myself, if the voice and body can trigger these things, can it conversely heal these things? You see, the body and the brain have plasticity. They want to change and they want to reset. I am walking proof that if the body and brain gets rewired after trauma, they can be rewired again, but in a healthy way. And kinesthetics help me do that. You see, after my assault and before kinesthetics, I had a feeling of being always off balance, both physically and psychologically. And this led to a constant, albeit unconscious, sense of fear. Imagine that your body is your good friend. A good friend wants to protect you after you've been hurt, but sometimes the body is protecting you in ways that it shouldn't, or in ways that you once needed, but are no longer necessary. It's like when you feel yourself about to fall, and you try to protect yourself. So you startle, and you grip, and you hold your breath. See, that provides a false sense of control, because you think you're catching yourself, but actually, by locking the muscles, you're more brittle. In my case, as a reaction to trauma, my body was trying to keep me armored and safe, but it caused me to be off balance. My chest tightened. It tipped forward in order to protect my heart center. My feet took on a wider stance, which gave me a false sense of sturdiness. I walked with a very tight and waddling motion, which is similar to a penguin, and my strides were too long, which tightened my hamstrings and also caused heel striking. That heel striking caused internal jolts to my skeletal system. My shoulder girdle and my arms barely swayed when I walked, and my toes were constantly curled under, gripping the earth when I stood at rest and on each forward stride. In total, rather than operating in the multiple integrated spirals as Lessac encourages, my tissues were relatively frozen, and my daily movements were very boxy, and I had a feeling of always bracing for impact. Now, with each step, I was replaying and reinforcing my trauma response, because I was constantly feeling that I was under attack in my own body. Through kinesthetics, I was able to release those patterns and reset the psychological pattern that occurred through every physical action. Every physical action causes a corollary psychological reaction. This freedom happened in so many ways during my training. But let me just give you one basic example. Wheel walking, which is the most effortless physical adjustment, produced a radical change in my neuro, psycho, and physiological way of being. As many of you know, wheel walking moves the crown of the head into an elevated position. The spinal column becomes elongated, the feet move under the hips, and there's a release in the coccyx, the pelvis, and the chest. After 4 weeks of the intensive last summer, I was actually measured as being an inch taller. My chest relaxed around my heart center, and I was able to expand my chest an extra 2 inches. I gained a fluidity of movement, and I didn't feel armored or off balance anymore. And internally, I felt a divine and profound sense of peace. Prior to wheel walking, my body was in a constant state of that old fight or flight response, which, by the way, there are additional responses, which are called freeze or collapse. Now, in the animal kingdom, the effect on an animal's body from fight, flight, freeze, or collapse is called tonic immobility. So how does an animal release this tonic immobility so they aren't traumatized the way that people are? I'll give you 2 examples of tonic immobility in the natural kingdom. Sharks. As some of you know, sharks can't swim backwards, and they have to be in constant forward motion. However, mysteriously, sharks experience tonic immobility, and they become hypnotized, and they become rigid and still. But you've never heard of a shark with PTSD. Similarly, animals who are potential prey animals, who are being chased and are eaten, are always under constant threat, but they aren't traumatized. When a gazelle outruns a lion, the gazelle reintegrates the fear toxins into the central nervous system through several involuntary responses, some of which include shaking, trembling, deep spontaneous breaths. That sounds like a familiar event. The list does go on. It's like I think about when a dog, you put a dog into a certain situation, and afterwards it kind of goes, it shakes it out, and then it resets, and it's like, cool, it's off in place, right? Same sort of philosophical idea in terms of physiologically resetting a psychological pattern. That happens in nature, but it doesn't always happen with us as people. And the result is traumatization. Now, since people who are traumatized and who experience mental illness are not accustomed to releasing the same traumatic energy, the body doesn't reset. So trauma remains locked in the central nervous system. And those people often experience a reoccurrence of their trauma and of their symptoms. Now, using Lessac's physical practices helped me resolve my autonomic immobility. At another time, we can discuss the many examples. But here are a few. Shaking during explorations of radiancy, floating during buoyancy, all the balance explorations, and the constant focus on breath mirrored the gazelle's response after outrunning the lion. Now, in the vocal work, I also achieved the same sense of release from trauma as I did during the physical work. Again, the examples are too many to name at this time, but scientists have discovered that sighing for pleasure is one of the most primal actions of the brain, because sighing appears to be regulated by the fewest number of neurons. Also, in a recent brain imaging study, researchers discovered that vibrations from humming change the brain and its response to trauma. Humming soothes what is called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is also known as the 10th cranial nerve, and there are two branches to the vagus nerve. The first branch is primal. It deals with fight or flight. The second branch is a more evolved branch, and that controls communication and self-soothing. Now, during trauma, that first primal branch becomes more dominant. Therefore, when experiencing PTSD or mental illness, that's why we become immobilized. We become unable to communicate, and we become unable to self-soothe or calm ourselves down, and our brain becomes flooded. Simply by humming, I was able to help that second branch of the vagus nerve become more dominant. I could strengthen it so that when faced with the reoccurrence of trauma, I wasn't flooded by that flight, fight, freeze, or collapse symptom, and I was able to communicate and self-soothe. Also, after my assault, my voice went through many iterations in order to unconsciously avoid attack. I began speaking in the upper third of my pitch range, as to not sound aggressive. Massive tension would strangle my throat when in emotional or threatening situations I got choked up. My voice developed a very pinched, flat, heavy, and a husky cover. Now, these were all unconscious techniques which made me feel safe, but they caused emotional distance. As an example, when I was sustaining the sounds, the humming sounds of L, N, or NG, I'm switching back and forth between one where there's a relaxation and one where there's a hard pressing. After the trauma, I was pressing very, very tough with the tongue and the tip of my mouth and my tongue. So I was not activating the vibration that was used to quiet the emotional system. because I was pressing too aggressively on the roof of my mouth with the middle and tip of my tongue. That's what gives it that flat kind of pinch sound. If you think about it in musical terms, there is a delicate vibration that the reed provides in certain reed instruments, and it provides them a resonance. Imagine if that reed is replaced by a metal bar. It wouldn't produce vibrations. So there was a grip to my sustained sounds, similar to the grip that I described in my body, that feeling of before you fall. There was a type of grip in my percussive sounds as well. Consonants such as D and T, I pressed hard into the sound using my mid-tongue and my tip, rather than delicately tapping the consonants. I observed that when making these percussive sounds, I felt a momentary hitch of energy, similar to that little moment before you fall on a roller coaster. There's that sense of D, T, T. You can feel like a pressure that's built up behind the sound, rather than just saying D, 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 right? Dog, Thomas, touching. There's a sense of push behind it. It was a way to control the sound and feel safe, but it also created an internal feeling of pressure behind every consonant. All this force and pressure behind both my sustained and my consonant sounds led me to receive feedback that my speech sounded aggressive. I also felt that in myself, I couldn't change my speech in order to communicate what I was trying to say, because people misunderstood my intention solely based on the sound of my speech. Again, these were self-protective habits. They kept people at a distance and unconsciously made me feel like I was in control. But they also reinforced my trauma response by replaying that same gripping that I described in the physicality, stopping yourself from falling, in speech and in movement. So every time I would speak, I would feel a microcosmic reinforcement of my trauma. By lessening these vocal habits, I was able to experience a more peaceful demeanor and offer other people something more in line with what my peaceful intentions were. Now, another aspect of kinesthetics vocal training that transformed me was by shifting my resonance sound, my resonance. My teachers, Phyllis Griffin and Crystal Robbins and Deb Kinghorn, as well as Nancy Krebs, really helped me because my self-defense mechanisms were very deeply entrenched. The most profound results occurred after experiencing the tonal 8, which explores structure, tone, and consonant action individually, and then it reintegrates all of them into one conversational speech. I found myself getting dizzy and lost in the emotion that the exercise was unleashing in me. But through the expert guidance of my teachers, as well as diligent self-teaching, I was able to fully uncover my authentic sound for the first time since my assault, which was gentle and unpressured and inviting. And I felt a euphoric sense of accomplishment and also a divine sense of peace. But along the road to a more peaceful way of being, I experienced flare-ups and flashbacks of trauma, which were triggered by the kinesthetics voice and body explorations. Many times I experienced those flashbacks in the last several years of Lessac training. But here are two examples that occurred during last summer's intensive. There's an exercise which is called the diamond-shaped shoulder girdle roll. Ostensibly what you're doing is rolling back onto your shoulder so that your feet try to touch the floor behind you. Inverting yourself that way, for those of you who haven't done it. You roll back onto your shoulder so that your feet are touching behind you. There's another series, which is a series of squats, which is ostensibly you're trying to keep your head in a plumb line over your knees as you squat, which causes the C curve in the body, the dorsal curve in the body. Both the shoulder girdle roll and the squat series triggered massive panic attacks and trauma flashbacks. What I realized, because again, I became curious, and I started to really analyze, well, what is happening to me? Why is this occurring? What I realized is that I was stimulating the motion of falling backwards. So I was abruptly flooded with mental images of my assault, being thrown into a metal stanchion, briefly blacking out, as well as being continually punched and repeatedly knocked unconscious, which all happened during my assault. So these two exercises were stimulating a similar feeling, and that's what was triggering me. I should just say, as a side note, I became interested in this work not because I had an idea or a concept beforehand and started experimenting, but because I was experiencing it in the moment. And I had to work backwards to say, what's happening? Right? I was triggered by these things without knowing that they would affect me. And then having experienced it, I had to stop and ask, what's happening? And how do I address it? Through the work. Because in moments where kinesthetic started triggering a trauma response, I became curious. I became curious if I could self-soothe my flight, fight, freeze, or collapse reaction, work through the traumatic response by continuing with the exploration rather than dropping out of it. But also, and this is important to me, I reached out for a lot of help from my teachers such as Phyllis and Crystal and Deb and Nancy. And they all came so generously to my aid. For me, the fact that my teachers, who I now consider my friends, were there for me is the most important part of this particular presentation. Because while many of you will not experiencing these, you won't experience these things yourself, it's very possible that you will teach someone who is processing PTSD or mental illness. They may never tell you. They also may never realize that it will trigger anything in them. And all of a sudden, they're flooded and they're lost at sea. So during the many flashbacks this summer, I asked Deb or Crystal to hold my hand and reassure me that I was not, in fact, in danger, and guide me through the remainder of the explorations. They mentored my growth with grace and compassion and mindfulness. I was able to feel my nervous system calm down, melt into the relaxation of the physical positions, and released a lot of repressed emotions. I reintegrated the fear toxins and repatterned my neurology in the way that animals do after threats, which then lessened my future trauma response. And subsequently, I now feel more joyful and buoyant and more at peace. So the important charge for us as teachers is, in my experience, twofold. First, to be present to your traumatized student, and to be present with open heart, an open mind, and open arms. First and foremost, to reassure them that they are safe. Second, to offer physical and emotional space. Encourage them to go only as far as is comfortable in an exploration. And then they should rest and leave it for another time, to give room for recuperation, which is something in our culture that we really jump past. It's okay to rest. It's okay to recuperate. It's okay to leave an exercise and come back to it. Also, I think it's very important to give time and space for intellectual and mental processing. I'm really passionate about saying this. It's something I've recently really become aware of. As theater teachers and practitioners, I've realized, we often tell each other, don't think about it. Just do it. Don't think about it, get out of your head. Don't think about it. And I want to challenge that belief. Thinking about it is wonderful. Forethought and reflection are really important. Those are tools that we use in order to feel safe. And that feeling of safety is most important when dealing with students with PTSD and mental health issues. I think we should say rather, don't judge it. Just try it. There's a difference between habit and danger. There's a difference between habit and danger. And sometimes when we're doing habitual actions, we think we're in danger. But sometimes we're in danger when doing habitual actions. It can be a very slow process, but we can encourage our students to move into what is beyond their habitual comfort zone, into a zone for taking risks, but only if we can keep them in what they consider a safe zone. Now, much later, when I was doing this research, and after I was experiencing these things, I discovered that Arthur Lessac himself believed that the trauma of being abandoned by his parents at age 2.5 is what led him to develop this work, and eventually what brought him into happiness and peace. He wrote that traumatized people, quote, are the prisoners behind great walls of silence, end quote. My hope is that this presentation will simply spur conversation, and I'm always available. I know that for myself, creating art and practicing Lessac kinesensics truly enriches my soul and helps me break down those great walls of silence. I now feel like the gazelle who, having finally outrun the lion, is finally able to shake off the constraints of trauma. Thank you very much.